Good afternoon. Good to see everyone again. Everybody's still awake and has a little energy left, I hope. So this next module is on designing an educational intervention and how to incorporate some best practices for success. So the learning objectives for this is by the end of this session, you should be able to identify educational projects that have a high scholarship potential, list the steps of curriculum development, and describe some commonly applied frameworks for learner assessment and evaluation. And as Rosa mentioned before, there's a little bit of intentional overlap. Some of the frameworks for assessment and evaluation we'll talk about again tomorrow. So why don't we start by waking everybody back up after the break, and you can share in the chat or raise your hand. But we think about what kind of ideas you have for an educational project. You really should align with sort of like your values and your interests and your passions. So what kind of clinical topics interest you? What kinds of learners do you like to interact with? Are there any issues in healthcare right now that's really worrying you that you think an educational project could help address? So let's take a few minutes as a group and I hear from all of you. And I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see everybody's faces again while we talk about these.
As a general pediatrician, I think there needs to be a lot more education in managing mental health problems like depression.
Good. I see somebody put in the chat, reducing racial healthcare disparities. Who put that in there? You want to talk about it?
Yeah, I put that in there, and that's a current, I'm currently working on developing that curriculum for our med students here at the University of Iowa. And it's one of my passions because as a Black woman, you always hear the statistic that Black women are 3 to 4 more times likely to die in childbirth than any other woman, even when like SES is controlled for. And why do like Black babies have like really bad infant mortality rates? Why do Black babies do better with Black doctors? So like all those types of things interest me. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Great. And there's a lot of opportunity there, I think, to do projects in that sort of space that not only are your passions, but I think is going to help the healthcare system improve ultimately. Gamification of learning. Who put that in there? Cindy? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. I've been doing a lot of escape rooms and like flip classroom types things and just trying to make learning a little bit more fun. So it's one of the topics that I'm really interested in. I don't exactly know where to go with it though. I'm a little stuck when it comes to that. So any advice would be great.
Good, but it sounds like it's a passion area, like something that's really interesting to you. So if you could, figure out a project and it's really something that's important to you, that's kind of like a good ingredients for you to be successful and motivated to see it through.
I was thinking about when I was a resident, I did escape rooms as like a board review for the in-training exam. But I like working with medical. I prefer the UME side a little bit more. So I'm thinking maybe creating like an escape room for medical students and just like on a specific topic or something, just trying to kind of narrow it down a little bit.
Good. And Ashley, I see you put in there race estimation of GFR. Can you expand on that with us?
So sorry, I'm having lunch and it's my camera being off. So,
That's okay.
so it's actually a really hot topic in nephrology right now. There's a task force with the American Society of Nephrology and the National Kidney Foundation. This actually got pushed by medical students, kind of questioning this, how we use only Black race in modifying like what we estimate GFR is for kidney function. So I gave a talk earlier this year and have an upcoming, or last year, and have an upcoming grand rounds about the topic. So I think by they've submitted their the task force has submitted their final recommendations for removing race from that estimation. But it'll be, I think, interesting going forward that not all our medical students won't learn it the same way we learned it, but how do we address that historical bias, or how do we teach about that historical bias? I think will be an important part of our curriculum. I gave the talk to students last year, and it was really well received because we don't have a lot of that in our curriculum currently. So I think that's a really good opportunity for me to kind of look at this as medical education novel curriculum and how we're addressing it specifically for nephrology. The other thing, a big passion of mine is actually I have a son who has he's had a kidney transplant, and so this whole as a nephrologist, this whole idea of, you know, we teach and I found it. I took over our curriculum 2 years ago, right when the pandemic started, but interesting how we only teach about really dialysis, and they get very little about it. So I think it's really important that physicians learn from the beginning that transplant is the way we should be going preemptively early. And if everybody in the entire medical field is emphasizing that, and there's less thought about dialysis and those modalities, I hope that we can start pushing that earlier. So these are kind of like the two, once we started today, these are kind of the ideas that I've started coming to mind. So.
Terrific. So you're not all just future scholars, but you are all future educational scholars with passions and ideas and thoughts. So that's really terrific.
Great.
Rosa?
So, yep, absolutely. So on the flip side of things, I think absolutely recognizing where your interests are, who your interested learners are. Now think about your own skills as the educator. So what teaching methods are you most familiar with? What teaching methods do you prefer? And what teaching methods are you interested in improving? Or as Cindy, in Cindy's example, are you really passionate about and really want to develop? Because I think there's, as we're thinking about sort of creating educational projects that are fit for scholarly work and publication, there's sort of what you teach, who you're teaching it to, and how you're teaching it. So take a minute and think about that. Again, we can sort of put it in the chat board. You can just speak out loud in terms of either sort of things you feel familiar with or something that may be a little bit different that you really want to explore.
Yeah, I think that
go on. Yes, Valerie, please.
I think that what I've seen the most of is PowerPoint. That's what I've used the most of. I think what I prefer the most is when there's small groups, there's talking, people can kind of generate ideas on their on their own, and I think it improves participation and also what people take away from it. So that's what I've been trying to lean more towards.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, I think that's right. I think definitely that sort of engaged learning is more effective learning, and there's science behind that. And then I think from a very pragmatic approach in terms of like what makes for a successful MedEd portal submission, I think, the sort of single PowerPoint presentation delivered as a lecture is probably less exciting, to the peer reviewers than something different. And Cindy, I just wanted to get back to your topic, because what interested me was that you are interested in this teaching modality as the topic itself, right? It's not like there is content that you can deliver through, but really exploring sort of the effectiveness or how to maximize the effectiveness of that, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So that's sort of a little bit of a twist on it, right? Where it's the actual method that you're interested in investigating and evaluating. Let me look on the chat board here. Great. So case-based learning, PBLs. I think a lot of people are sort of interested in the more engaged learning modalities. And again, I think this is a fabulous forum for networking. So we want this to continue. So if you guys want to hear more about Cindy's work, definitely, Cindy, let them reach out to you. I think this is where good stuff happens. Okay, let's get back to the slides. So here's a little exercise, which I think we've actually started to engage in already. But if you have a little piece of paper and just jot it down and think about these 4 components, which are sort of the questions that Ray and I just asked you, like, I want to teach, and like, who are the learners that light you up, right? Is it med students? Is it residents? Is it other faculty members? So I want to write that word down. This is a little bit of a Mad Libs about the topic. What is that topic that you are passionate about? Then enter that teaching method that you are sort of gravitating towards. And so that I can improve. So what would your outcomes be? So what do you want to actually accomplish from that? And again, I think these are all sort of questions that we just asked you, but if you kind of put it together, and you look at it, take a step back, you may have your educational project right there. So take a minute to do that for yourself. And if anybody would like to maybe share what sentence they came up with, that'd be great.
I can share.
Thanks, Joy.
So I said, I want to teach medical students about racial healthcare disparities using case-based learning so that I can improve health outcomes for people of color.
Fantastic. It's really like, I feel like you've just created like your mission statement for your educational project, right? And so that's going to be like your North Star. If it resonates with you, Joy, if you feel like, yes, this encapsulates sort of what I want to do this year, then let that be your North Star. Let that be your guiding light as you sort of develop the project itself. Does anyone want to share one more? And it's okay if it's not fully fleshed out. I mean, this is something you can mull over tonight or over the weekend or even the next week, right? But I think that, if you come up with the right words to fill in these components, I think you will find something that really lights you up, that's going to get you excited for this year's project. Okay, Ray, let's move on to the next slide then. All right. So again, we have an eye towards publication, right? So we have our passions, we have what we want to do. How can we make sure from the start that it has a high likelihood of getting published? We have to continue to ask ourselves these questions from the beginning. Okay. So the first is, does it address an important need? I think we sort of highlighted this already, but what problem is it focusing on? Joyce is perfect, right? Joyce is really addressing the racial disparities, right? Health inequities. So obviously that's an important one. So check the box, yes. The next one would be, does it fill a gap in the literature? So this is where we really have to do our homework and see what's out there already, because it doesn't necessarily contribute to, to our body of knowledge or our medical advancement and educational advancement if it's already out there. So all of us really will have to do a lit search and see what's out there and how can our project build upon that and move the needle forward. Yes, and Kathy's saying, don't forget to search MedEd portal. Absolutely, right? Because if that's the forum in which you want to submit it, you want to make sure that it doesn't already exist. But I think you can also strengthen it too. If there's something similar, you can look at that and say, this is what's out there, right? And then this is how your project builds upon that knowledge or moves it forward. So I think that don't give up and turn away if you find that there's something out there already. Think about how you can take that experience and advance it through a slightly different project. And then lastly is the issue of generalizable. Okay, remember I said MedEd portals focus in the product. They want it sort of off the shelf, ready to use. They want other schools, other educators to be able to use your product to advance education. So you always want to think about sort of how generalizable is it. if you have like sort of a niche topic, first of all, like for example, Emma and I work at the same institution, work at the same medical school, so we might find that we really want to create an educational module or workshop for our students so they know how to access our career advising services. Let's say we feel like that's a need we need to fill. Well, that may be great for our school, but how generalizable might that be at your institutions, right? So you have to sort of stop and ask yourself that question. So if you can say yes to these 3 questions, again, that definitely increases the likelihood for successful publication. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to go through sort of the systematic approach to educational projects. Some of you may be familiar with these frameworks, and if you are, that's okay. Then I just ask you to chime in and share your knowledge with the group. But for those for whom this is something new, I'm going to really emphasize how important these frameworks are. Having a systematic approach to creating an educational project would be, and would really encourage you to look further than the slides that we're going to present next to really get knowledgeable about this. Next slide. Okay, so you can click raise your hand or, on your screen if you're familiar with Kern's 6-step model for curriculum development. Is anyone familiar with it? Okay, great. That's terrific. Oh, you are, Michelle. Okay, terrific. So I had never heard of this until I was, 5 years into being an attending physician, teaching medical students, working on a clerkship, when I suddenly said, I'd like to develop some curriculum and do something more. And then a mentor said, here's the book, take the book. And I think that was probably the best, most valuable sort of physical book that I have read as a medical educator. So there is a book written by David Kern called Curriculum Development for Medical Education, a 6-step approach. This is a schema of it. I encourage you guys to really read it. You can find, articles about it, but I think having the book itself is incredibly helpful. Much like the way MedEd Portal fashions its ESR template and tells you step by step what to do to create this, submission, Kern's model tells you step by step how you can create a curricular project that is going to not only be effective, but really sort of ready for publication. So be familiar with it. There's the 6 steps are really problem identification and a general needs assessment, followed by a targeted needs assessment of your learners. The next step is goals and specific measurable objectives, followed by developing your educational strategies. The 5th step is implementation, and then the 6th is evaluation and feedback. And I'm racing through these on purpose because we're actually going to look at a slightly different modified version of this framework. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is taken from Kern's framework. It's 5 steps. It was developed by Grace Huang, who's the editor-in-chief of MedEd Portal. It's more streamlined, but it really touches upon most of the elements in Kern's 6-step framework. So we're going to go through this step by step to help you think about how to apply this framework to your own educational project. And for those of you who already have a project in mind, that's great. You can sort of visualize and conceptualize each of these steps. And for those of you who don't know yet what your project is going to be, that's fine. Just look at this with an open mind and think about it as you take your inspired activities or topics and think about how to move it forward. Okay, so I think Ray, you're going to take it from here, right?
Sure. So the first step in this framework is a needs assessment. And in the current model, it's a needs assessment and stakeholder engagement are 2 separate steps. But in this more simplified model, they're sort of combined. But the really key elements that are important for you to do up front when you design your project in order for it to be successful. One, and we sort of talked about it already, is what's the problem that your medical education intervention is designed to address? It could be a clinical problem, it could be a sociologic problem. If your project is actually around a teaching modality, it could be a learning problem rather than an education problem. So there's what's the problem? And then think about your stakeholders, who this is going to affect and in what sort of way. Are the stakeholders your learners themselves? Are the stakeholders the educational environment that they're in? Are the stakeholders patients that hopefully what the outcome might be different based on what you're teaching your learners? So identifying who the stakeholders might be. Third is a literature review. We really, really cannot underestimate the value of your literature review. The last thing you want to do is design and implement and study something. And then when you're doing a little more work or get it kicked back from somebody, just to find out that 5 other people have done the same exact thing and already published it in different journals. So then you've realized, oh my gosh, what I've done really isn't unique after all. And that's really important for MedEd Portal, because in MedEd Portal, there's a lot of stuff already there. So for example, in my one of my mentees last year really wanted to do some work around microaggressions and anti-racism, where there's a significant amount of things in MedEd Portal already around microaggressions. So they were really needed to not just, I mean, if that's their passion, that's fine, but you'd have to figure out, how is my project different than the others? Or did the other projects bring up something that we need to know more about? And that's what my next project around microaggressions is going to count. And then some sort of systematic data collection. Has any other prior things actually been evaluated in a systematic way? So the next step is really to define your goals and your objectives. And that's really kind of what you've done already with the exercise at the beginning. Your overall aim, your overall project goal will be that you want to teach these learners about a topic using this method so that I can improve something. And that's sort of the general scheme of what your overall study question is going to be and what your overall aim of your project is going to be. The next step, and I'll go back up to point this out. So the next step, actually, these are combined steps as well, sorry, is not only do you want to have a overall sort of goal for your project, but then you want to have discrete learning objectives for your educational module or intervention itself. You probably have picked up by now that every one of the things we've done so far today has begun with learning objectives. And learning objectives start with the stem of, by the end of this activity, the learner should be able to ... And then there's a verb. And the verb of the learning objective is very important. And because that is going to set the stage for everything else that you're going to do in your learning activity. So for example, here are some verbs. And if you look at the verbs that are underlined and you look at the verbs that are not underlined, the verbs that are underlined are really more amenable to what we call sort of to a SMART evaluation. Some of you may have created SMART goals before. So the SMART acronym means it's specific, it's measurable, it's actionable, it's relevant, and it's time bound. So to have a learning objectives that says by the end of this activity, the learner should be able to describe X, Y, Z, you can just design your activity to do that, and you can evaluate at the end and say, can my learners describe this in whatever your post-assessment tool? As opposed to some more vague verbs like realize or understand, it's very hard to sort of measure those sorts of things. So the learning objective is really a well-crafted learning objective is really one of the most important things in your educational module. And if I look at the fellows that I mentored last year, I kicked a lot of back and forth where they had items in their learning objectives that were not really covered in their project, and they had a bunch of information in their PowerPoint and in their case studies that didn't really address any one of the specific learning objectives. So you really need to make sure what you're doing ties back to your learning objectives. And again, just to drive this home, a not so good learning objective would say by the end of this activity, the learner should be able to understand health disparities of patients with breast cancer, which is different and more better worded if you said by the end of this activity, participants will be able to cite disparities in breast cancer prevalence and outcomes. So that's something that you could test in a quiz or a post survey that's very closely tied to your learning objectives. So not only so the learning objectives really set the tone for everything. So your learning objective should really then dictate what type of teaching method you're going to use. If your learning objective is one around knowledge, like by the end of this activity, somebody can recognize or describe something, then, a lecture may be a fine way to do that. But if the learning objective says by the end of this activity, someone should be able to compare and contrast, then you're probably going to have some other teaching method with some case studies or activities that your learners are going to do. For example, if your learning objective would be obtain a comprehensive history from a gender minority patient, appropriate teaching methods for that might be a video or some sort of role play. And an appropriate evaluation tool might be to have them actually do this with a standardized patient and score them on an OSCE. This slide is way too busy for you to read, but there's this grouping or description of learning objectives called Bloom's taxonomy. And it's something that you should familiarize yourself before. I actually have a simplified version of this that I can send to JP to send out to everybody. But again, it's about syncing up the verb of your learning objective with an appropriate type of learning activity and then an appropriate assessment method of your learners. And there's different domains. At the lower end are just knowledge, where the verb might be describing or naming or recognizing. Further up, say in the application domain, your verbs may be things such as to evaluate or use or implement. So, or actually evaluates on the far end. But anyway, you can see as you go up the scale from knowledge to comprehension to application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, if those are the verbs in your learning objectives, you then rely on different strategies to teach and different ways to evaluate your learners. So let's stop. Everybody wrote down their aim with that green arrow from before, and a couple folks shared them with us. So go back to what you did before for your aim statement for those items in that arrow. If you remember, it was, I want to teach who, about what, using this technique so that I can improve. And then think about how you might want to teach that, and then maybe just create one learning objective for what your educational session might have. So let's take a minute or two and think and pull out some paper and let's have a stab at writing some learning objectives. Anybody want to share? Let me rephrase that. Maybe you don't want to share. Can somebody share?
We have one on the chat board.
Oh, sorry, I'm managing multiple things. Okay, let's look at this. I'm going to teach program directors and faculty members about increasing diversity in their workforce using PowerPoint and small groups to improve. So by the end of this learning objectives, my learners should be able to highlight disparities in the general population and in the medical field. Okay.
Sorry, I meant to say like in backgrounds and diversity.
Yeah. So, I would, would probably change up your verb to, I would go back to something on Bloom's taxonomy and pick a verb that's actually listed in there. It may not be highlight, it may be something like recognize or describe. And then you may want to narrow this down because, again, about what you're trying to teach. And so it might be health outcomes, or it might be something else like your quote in the medical field. So I think this is a great start at a learning objective. I think you could think about what specifically is that you're going to have in your content, and then you can sort of do a little bit of front and back and sort of revise. You can't talk about every health disparity or every racial disparity in the world. You can't cover that, right? So your topic is going to be much more narrower, and so that your learning objective would be narrower as well. Great.
There's another one, Ray, in the chat board.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw it.
So Joy, that's terrific. So what is it that you want your students to really do? Like,
So part of the curriculum, in addition, I know it's very broad to talk about racial healthcare disparities, but I really want to hone in on the fact why, because everybody knows that we have these health inequities, but I'm wondering if medical students really understand why they persist and how they do persist. So I'm at the University of Iowa, we use EPIC. And so, for example, someone had mentioned this before with the kidneys, like, do we need to put in race? Can we even remove that as an option? Do we have to check that box? Something like that. So I'm going to improve the environment that we're currently at. So.
Sure. So, I think of a learning objective for that of something like you would like your learners to be able to identify common practices that reinforce anti-racist policies. That would be something, and then you could teach about that, such as, the standard H&P format where race is always interjected in there, and then what is the implications of that? So,
thank you.
That makes sense.
If I could also add, I think it's important to also keep in mind the difference between competency, cultural competency, and cultural humility. Both are equally valuable. And especially since we have some individuals that are specifically working on medical Spanish modules, the development of medical Spanish is to help people reach certain competencies. Whereas the use of language lines so that you could speak to a patient in their first language would be more of an appreciation of cultural humility. And I just share that because the journal is open to receiving materials in both areas. So it's just more of an extension of the conversation around race and ethnicity, because this is an important topic, and we probably have not evolved as much competency material within the journal either.
Good. Thank you. So the next step after you've done your needs assessment, you filled out that green arrow of what your aim statement is. You write your learning objectives of what you want to do. You need to identify some resources to get you started. And it really depends on what your project is going to be as to what your resources you're going to need. So one resource you're going to need for your project is learners. So if you're going to design an educational thing for medical students and you want to deliver it and test it, you have to stop and think, what medical students am I going to do with this with? And where am I going to find them? And at what point in medical school is somebody going to let me come in and teach them this? Is it going to be on their pediatric clerkship? Is it going to be in, in the second year? Is it only going to be in students who are part of a certain club or affinity group? So you really have to think about, you may have the best idea in the world, but you have to identify where you're going to get your cohort of learners that are actually going to participate in what you're going to do. You also need to, figure out who your teachers are. Your teacher may be you, but you may have to find some others going to co-teach or help you teach this, especially if you're going to use some strategy like simulation and small group facilitation and things like that. The builders is what we call the builders are other people who may need to help you with some technical and other aspects. For example, if you want to do a video as part of your educational module, who's going to make the video? Who's going to edit the video? What kind of software are you going to use? What platform are you going to host it on? So there's a bunch of building materials that you're going to need for your educational module. And then again, if it's a live thing, what materials do you need in the classroom? If it's small group learning, do you need hand printed worksheets? Do you need flip charts? Or if it's not in the classroom, do we need Zoom with breakout rooms or what have you? And then lastly, the other builder to think about is sort of the time that it's going to take. And is this a 20-minute quick learning activity? Is this an hour-long module? Is this a series of 3 modules? It's going to total 4 hours, depending on the scope of the project that you want to do. And again, time for your learners and time for your teachers is an important construct to keep in mind. I think you all know by now that it's kind of hard to keep your interest up hours and hours on end, right? But getting everybody together for a half a day is kind of the only way one of the few options we have to do something like today. But if you have learners that you can figure something else out that's shorter or longer where you're going to do this module, that's another strategy. So think about the curricular time that it's going to take as well.
Great. Thanks, Ray. One last thing I want to say about the resources is that I think it's particularly important to think about that for your MedEd portal submissions, because remember, MedEd portal wants a sort of ready to use off-the-shelf product that is generalizable and easily used by other institutions. So if you have a very, very resource intensive project that takes a lot of people and a lot of materials to sort of deliver a 60-minute session, it's probably not going to be easily to use at other institutions. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so the next step in the curriculum development framework is really developing the strategies and implementing it. And I think we've talked about this a lot already, so I'll just breeze through it. Next slide, please, Ray. So again, how you teach it must match sort of what you're teaching, right? So he talked, Ray gave you some good examples of this already. So if you're talking about knowledge, then sort of lectures or some sort of, online modules may be appropriate. But if you're really talking about skills development, that's what you want your learners to get, then you're going to need something probably more interactive like a simulation or some sort of workshop. Next slide. Okay, I didn't mean to be too quick. So if there are any questions about sort of implementation, please stop me. I mean, you're going to spend a good part of this year working with your mentors in sort of exactly fashioning out that strategy and the implementation. And you're going to include that in your MEDED portal submission, because remember, in the appendices is actually like those tools that you're using. What are your deliverables? What are you actually using to teach? How are you teaching it? So I'm going to move on next to evaluating the curriculum, which in my mind has always been sort of the most daunting part of it. So let's just try to break it down. And again, I think with evaluation, it's just so much easier if you think about evaluation in the very, very beginning, from the beginning, just as much as you're thinking about the topic and what excites you, think about how am I going to evaluate this? Next slide. So it's really helpful when you're thinking about evaluation to think about some frameworks, and I think many of you are very familiar with them already. So the sort of knowledge, skills, and attitudes framework is really about sort of what do you expect your learners to acquire, to get out of your actual educational activity, right? Do you want them to learn something new, get new knowledge? Do you want them to be able to do something different, better? Skills? Do you want to change the way they think about an issue? So in attitudes. And next slide, I think there's some follow-ups. So again, as you're thinking about how you're going to deliver it and then how you're going to evaluate whether your learners actually accomplished what you wanted them to do, you're going to create an evaluation tool that matches knowledge, skills, and attitudes appropriately. So here are some good examples. So obviously with knowledge, we're all familiar with the USMLE STEP exams. That's a sort of reason, multiple choice questions are reasonable ways to evaluate whether learners have acquired knowledge. Simulations, OSCEs are great to assess whether skills have been acquired, and surveys can be very useful in terms of measuring attitude changes. Next slide. Okay, is anyone familiar with Kirkpatrick's model or Kirkpatrick's pyramid? Okay, so this is another really useful framework for thinking about how to evaluate the effectiveness and the impact of your learning activity. So in terms of the Kirkpatrick's model is shaped as a pyramid, and it really sort of goes up, starts at sort of a basic or easy to measure level, maybe easy to capture, not so much impact, going up to harder to capture and more impact. So at the base, level 1 is really the perceptions or the reactions of your learners. Did they like it? Were they satisfied? Did they find it effective, right? So that's an easy pre and post survey, right? So that's a level 1 in the Kirkpatrick model. Level 2 is learning. Did they actually, did the activity increase their knowledge, skills, and attitude? So you may want to evaluate that, with a test of some sort, like the OSCE or a multiple choice question exam. Level 3 is behavior. Did the activity actually affect or change the way the learners are practicing in the work environment? And again, if you think about it, that's a little bit harder to capture, right? To measure and to prove that that's happening, but it certainly has more impact. And then ultimately, certainly in medical education, when we think about the final level 4 impact is, does it actually improve or impact patient care, right? So we're in the business of educating healthcare providers so that they deliver better care. And really our ultimate outcome is impacting the patient. So does this educational intervention actually save patients' lives, improve their health? Ray, can you forward? I think there's some nice examples. So this was, if you're thinking about an educational activity to help healthcare providers discuss breast cancer screening, with patients, you can think about, so let's say you gave them a module on how to talk to your patients about breast cancer screening, right? So it's very easy to do an attitude survey on the trainees themselves. Did you find this session to be effective? Did it help you? Then you could also do an OSCE test if you want to get to level 2. Did this training module actually help them, discuss or counsel patients on breast cancer screening more effectively? Level 3, behavior in the real work environment. Did this educational activity impact or change the way these trainees were actually talking to their patients and actually counseling their patients about it? And ultimately, level 4 would be, did this educational activity actually increase screening to the point that it decreased breast cancer mortality? So, it's really, really hard if you think about your educational activities that you have in mind to get to level 4 in the Kirkpatrick's module. And that shouldn't stop you guys from doing your their projects anyway. I think most of what we find, I think, and correct me, maybe Kathy or JP, but I think for MedEd Portal, you know, they like to see sort of level 2. Level 3 would be great, but level 1 might be okay if the topic, the content, the project itself or its delivery is so novel, or so innovative or so important. Any questions or thoughts about this? Okay. All right, let's move on. Can you do the next slide, Ray? Sorry.
Hold on a second. Sorry, I'm
Oh, no, that's okay.
freezing up for some reason.
Okay. As you screen, the next slide is basically just for you to think to yourself about, again, what is the right evaluation approach for your own project. So think about this before you actually have the project laid out. Sort of that early sort of steps and foresight will really go a long way to making this a far easier process for you in terms of actually writing it and submitting it for publication. Next. Okay, so I think we're sort of, next slide. So I think we've gone through all of the steps in Huang's modified framework for curriculum development. And I think what we wanted to do lastly, I think Ray and I, we were going to sort of share with you very briefly some examples from our own work in MedEd Portal. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is a MedEd Portal, my first MedEd Portal submission, which I did with my colleagues at Albert Einstein College of Medicine a number of years ago. And this was about creating a group observed structural clinical encounter, or GOSCE for short, for formative assessment of communication skills for internal medicine clerks. So our needs is just going through the steps in Huang's model. So our needs assessment was that we had a local needs assessment. We said, you know, clerkship directors felt that our students still needed more observations, more feedback, more opportunities to get better at addressing or dealing with challenging communication skills. We followed up with a literature search, looking at ways to teach this, looking specifically at group modalities for teaching it because it was more cost effective than individual OSCEs. And found that there was really not much in the literature, yet this topic still addressed sort of a globally important problem of really having healthcare providers capable and competent at tackling these challenging communications issues. So using that, we defined our goals and objectives, and our goal was to really create a GOSCE to teach advanced communication skills to students during their medicine clerkship, and to use this group format to also help them develop peer feedback, peer observation, and peer feedback skills. And our specific learning objectives was using these 4 station cases to help our students be able to motivate a patient to consider quitting smoking, to illustrate how to deal with an angry patient who expects treatment that is not recommended by the provider, to identify a patient's goals and concerns regarding treatment for diabetes mellitus, and to establish a partnership and consensus on a preferred treatment plan with the patient, to demonstrate empathic delivery of bad news to a patient, to practice patient communications within a group setting, and also to demonstrate the delivery of specific and effective feedback to peers. So that's a mouthful. It was 6 specific learning objectives, but we tried to address them all and evaluate them all in our project. And for us, in terms of identifying resources, I think this was actually one of the most sort of novel parts of our submission, in that we were creating a GOSCE, so we wanted it to be cost effective. So we really planned out how many SPs were required for what number of students, how much money this would cost, how much time it would take, how much faculty resources were needed. So we really kept an eye towards sort of how this could be generalizable and used at other institutions. So I think this was actually one of the, even though you don't really think of the resources as being sort of the sexiest part of a project, I think this was actually pretty novel for our submission. And then in terms of developing the strategies and implementing it, we described sort of each of the cases in our appendix. We had the case itself. We had the rubrics that the evaluators used to grade, to give feedback to the students on the cases. And so we had faculty and SP instructions for each of the cases as well. So we really created a full package as part of our MedEd Portal submission. And then lastly, when we evaluated the curriculum, we used pre and post GOSCE surveys to rate students' confidence confidence in their skills related to the learning objectives. So again, we sort of stuck to Kirkpatrick level 1. I think we did submit this before 2019, so probably our chances for getting it accepted were higher. But I think that was deemed to be sufficient by the peer reviewers at that time. Next, I think Ray's going to give an example of his work.
Yeah, and here's an example of MedEd portal submission of mine. This was actually, the title was Introducing Trainees to Academic Career Roles and Responsibilities, and is actually one of the modules from the original BINGAP conference designed. So it was part of a larger framework. So the needs assessment we did was really largely done by a literature review that demonstrated that many medical students and residents, particularly those underrepresented in medicine and racial and ethnic groups underrepresented in medicine, really didn't have an understanding or knowledge of career options in academic medicine and didn't even consider them sometimes just because of a lack of knowledge. And so our program goal, my green statement for this was, I want to teach diverse trainees about careers in academic medicine by using self-reflection and case-based learning so that I can improve their knowledge of academic career options and self-assess their interest in preparation for an academic career. So that was sort of the lofty goal statement. And then we had a couple of learning objectives. I don't know if you can read them on this slide. One was to define academic medical center roles and responsibilities. 2 was to assess the alignment of academic center roles with their own personal goals and interests. And then the 3rd was to identify factors that support an academic medicine career trajectory. And if you think about those 2, 3, the 1st and the 3rd had verbs of define and identify, which are sort of like knowledge comprehensive things. Whereas assess is a little higher level of a verb in Bloom's taxonomy, where they needed to really evaluate something. So the resources, we had the resources really of BINGAP and a bunch of board members and other faculty in this space to help us give input into the development of the module. The logistics were really part of a larger BINGAP process. So our educational strategies, we used a couple of teaching. One was just a PowerPoint instructional sort of lecture thing, and that really hit the define and identify learning objectives of just knowledge. And then we had a structured self-assessment instrument that really helped them walk through identifying what their own careers and interests and talents might be, and then help decide if an academic career might be right for them. And then we did some case studies of some hypothetical medical students to really foster discussions in the group about picking opportunities as a career or as a faculty member that might be of interest to them. And so those sort of activities really hit on the assess type of learning objective. And then lastly, we evaluated it with workshop surveys before and after that we tied to these learning objectives. So those are 2 examples of what we did. You write this up in MedEd portal in what's called the ESR, or the Educational Summary Report that's been mentioned here today. And yet it's a required portion of your submission, and it's actually sort of like the paper that you think about. And it outlines all of the things that you need almost in a checklist fashion that you need. And so you need to use your objectives to design your activity, identify your sources, and then really rely on this worksheet from the ESR to outline exactly how you're going to describe this in your ultimate publication. So we are going to stop there, and if there's any reflections or questions or thought about what Rosa and I just presented around curriculum development and learning objectives and the like, now's a great time.
So evaluation is a big component. I'll just add, a lot of people get stressed about evaluation. I think we get stressed about evaluation probably from having gone through graduate school or medical school and being told if a study does not have a large sample size of 1,000 people, if it doesn't have a complex statistical analysis, if it's not prospective, if it doesn't have a case and control group, it's not valid. Why couldn't you find a better study? Is this the best you could find? And comments like that. That is the culture I remember living in. It is important to realize that Medit Portal is a different journal that many people aren't aware of. Medit Portal is finally giving you credit for the teaching materials and the curriculum that you have developed, sometimes over months and years. It is about the videos, the PowerPoints, the cases, the simulation. It is not about the final analysis or a lengthy description of the assessment instrument or of the statistics. That is why it's really important to get rid of all that noise, all that bias, and realize that you can have a successful submission just by capturing perception data. Asking people before they start a session, how confident are you in discussing, and I'm going to use my own module, the health issues and health needs of patients who identify as Puerto Rican? And then asking after the module, how confident now do you feel? Confidence is a perception. That is sufficient for Medit Portal. That is different than what many of you have probably experienced in your lifetime, if that makes sense. Valerie?
When I was looking at the articles that you had sent out, it looks like a lot of them have a qualitative aspect as well to the evaluation. Is that necessary or just like strongly encouraged or?
Rosa Ray?
Well, I love qualitative data. I think it adds a real richness. I think particularly, certain topics lend itself really well to qualitative data. Like I feel like a lot of you guys are sort of circling around issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and there's just so much rich data that can be gotten out of qualitative data analysis. It's just very time consuming and resource intensive. So if you're gonna do that, plan ahead and think about how you're gonna do it. That's just my word of advice, but I love qualitative data. I don't think it's a requirement though for Medit Portal submissions.
No, I don't think. I think actually qualitative data is very difficult in this format. If you're gonna publish qualitative data, you need to use some sort of structured thematic analysis at a minimum, and whether or not you do really formal qualitative research where you triangulate and do some of these other things. So if you've never done it before, you need a person on your team who knows how to do qualitative research in order to include that. That being said, on one of my submissions, we asked some open-ended questions on our evaluation tools about what people liked and we didn't like. And we actually inserted some representative sort of comments that we got on our evaluation tools and stated in our methods that we really didn't perform a formal thematic analysis or qualitative analysis. And they took that and they allowed us to put them in there. But if you design it as a qualitative or a mixed method study, there's really a true method that you have to follow. And Dr. Abali, you want to follow that up?
I was going to say the same thing, Ray, that qualitative analysis is not required in Medit Portal, but sampling and putting some representative comments from open-ended surveys are very useful. But be truthful that you don't all put that is everything is great, but put representative what worked and what did not work, because I think as a editor, I would ask that question. Not everything always work well, and the person who will run your module at their school, they will benefit from what did not work more than what worked at your institution. So those are very valuable. They're not really qualitative data analysis, and don't use the words that are used for qualitative analysis, so that you do not give the impression that you have done qualitative analysis.
So instead, we could just say, like, as a qualitative response, X reported this was helpful, Y reported this should be improved.
So I always encourage along those lines, look at Meta portal publications and see how other people did it. There is the theory, right? The theoretical, and then there is the practical application.
Mm-hmm.
Mimicking someone is not plagiarism. Following someone's study approach and the reporting of data is not plagiarism. It is using a best practice. Use the 23 Meta portal publications as a template to know how to describe both your quantitative and qualitative data. Our job is to review whatever you do and say, this is a red flag, be careful. You're saying you analyzed your qualitative data. You did not apply in a rigorous approach. You're not analyzing data. Dr. Abali said it very clearly. You are sharing some open-ended comments. Important distinction.